"Stop acting like the victim," my son said, and just like that, something inside me went very still. Not broken, not shattered, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you finally understand what's been happening all along. We were sitting at the same dining table I'd polished every Sunday for over 30 years, the one with the small scratch near the edge where Daniel used to bang his toy trucks as a boy. The overhead light cast a warm glow across the plates I had carefully set, roast chicken still steaming, green beans lined up just the way he liked them. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. I remember folding my napkin slowly, placing it beside my plate, buying myself a few extra seconds to think. "I'm not acting," I said softly, though my voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Daniel didn't look at me. He reached for his glass of water, took a sip, then set it down with that same casual indifference he used when he talked about the weather or traffic. "Mom, you're overreacting," he added, as if the disappearance of my life savings was a minor inconvenience, like a late bill or a misplaced receipt. Behind him, Ashley leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp, observant. She had that look she always wore when she thought she was the smartest person in the room. I'd seen it before, just never directed at me. Not like this. That morning, I had logged into my bank account the way I always did at the start of the month, with a cup of black coffee and the morning light filtering through the kitchen window. It was a simple habit, something my husband, Robert, had insisted on when he was still alive. "Always know where you stand," he used to say. For 42 years, I had followed that advice. And that morning, for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize what I saw. The balance didn't just look wrong. It looked empty. Not completely empty, but close enough to make my chest tighten. $42.13. I remember reading the number twice, then a third time, as if it might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. It didn't. I clicked through the transaction history, my fingers steady even as my thoughts began to race. Transfer after transfer. Small amounts at first. Then larger ones. All authorized. All approved. All signed with a name that made my stomach drop. Daniel Collins. My son. The same boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. The same boy I had worked 2 jobs to put through college. The same boy who now sat across from me, telling me I was playing the victim. I didn't accuse him right away. I didn't call the bank or raise my voice or demand answers. Instead, I invited them over for dinner. I cooked his favorite meal. I set the table the way I always had. I waited. And now here we were. "It's not like you were using that money," Daniel continued, finally glancing in my direction, his tone almost defensive now, as if he needed to justify something to himself more than to me. "It was just sitting there." Just sitting there. I let those words settle in the air between us. That money wasn't just sitting there. It was my safety, my future. The quiet promise I had made to myself after Robert passed that I would never have to depend on anyone again. And yet here I was, looking at my own son, and realizing I already had. I studied his face then, really studied it, searching for something familiar. Some trace of the boy I used to know. But all I saw was someone else. Someone distant. Someone who had already decided I didn't matter. And that was when it became clear to me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. One they had made together long before I ever opened that bank account that morning. I glanced once more at Ashley, still standing there, still watching. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Because in that silence, I understood everything. And I realized for the first time that losing the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finally seeing the truth. After they left that night, I did not clean the table right away. I just sat there, staring at the empty chair Daniel had pushed back too quickly, the faint scrape still echoing in my ears. The house felt different once the front door closed behind them. Quieter, but not in the peaceful way I used to know. It was a hollow kind of quiet, the kind that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be. The ticking of the clock above the stove. The soft hum of the refrigerator. Even my own breathing felt unfamiliar. I reached for my glass of water and noticed my hand was steady. That surprised me. I had expected shaking, maybe even tears. But there was nothing like that. Just a calm that settled deep in my chest, heavier than any panic could have been. I stood up slowly and began clearing the plates, stacking them one by one, the way I had done thousands of times before. The routine felt almost comforting. Familiar movements in a moment that was anything but familiar. When I carried the dishes to the sink, I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window. For a second, I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. Her posture was straighter. Her expression was unreadable. Not hurt, not angry, just resolved. I turned on the faucet and let the warm water run over my hands, watching it swirl down the drain. Robert used to stand behind me in this very spot, drying dishes while I washed. He would hum softly, off-key, without even realizing it. I could almost hear it now, if I let myself. But I did not let myself. Not tonight. Instead, I dried my hands carefully and walked back to the dining room. The table was bare now, the plates gone, the food put away. It looked like nothing had happened. And yet everything had. I sat down again, this time in Robert's old chair, the one I had never taken for myself until now. The wood felt solid beneath my hands as I rested them on the armrests. He always said this chair had the best view of the room. I understood that now. From here, I could see everything clearly. Every corner, every detail. No blind spots. I reached for my phone and opened my bank account again. The numbers had not changed. Of course they had not. But this time, I was not looking at them in disbelief. I was studying them. Each transaction, each date, each transfer. Patterns began to form the longer I looked. Small amounts at first, spaced out just enough to avoid attention. Then larger ones more frequent. A slow, careful process. This had not been done in a moment of desperation. This had been planned. Over weeks, maybe months. I scrolled further back, tracing the timeline like a thread, and I realized something that made my lips press into a thin line. It had started shortly after Daniel insisted on helping me simplify my finances. I could still hear his voice from that afternoon, calm and reassuring. You do not need to worry about all these accounts, Mom. It is too much to keep track of. And I had believed him. I had sat right here at this table while he walked me through the changes, trusting every word, every click. Trusting him. I set the phone down gently and leaned back in the chair. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way truths close in once they are seen. There was no confusion left. No questions. Just answers I had not wanted before. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to think. Truly think. Panic would have been easier. Anger would have been louder. But neither would help me now. What I needed was clarity. And for the first time all day, I felt like I had it. When I opened my eyes again, I stood up and walked toward the hallway where my desk sat against the wall. The same desk where I kept important papers, neatly organized in folders labeled years ago in careful handwriting. I pulled open the drawer and took out the folder marked estate. Robert had insisted on that too. Always have a plan, he used to say. I placed the folder on the desk and ran my fingers along the edge, feeling the weight of it. Not just paper, but decisions. Safeguards. Protections. Things I had hoped I would never need to use this way. But hope, I realized, was not a strategy. Not anymore. I opened the folder slowly, scanning the documents inside, each page a reminder that I was not as powerless as they seemed to think. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own home, I understood something with absolute certainty. They believed I had nothing left. They believed they had already won. And that belief, more than anything else, was going to be their first mistake. I did not sleep that night, not because I could not, but because sleep felt unnecessary when everything I needed to understand was already wide awake inside me. Instead, I sat at my desk long after midnight. The soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the documents spread in front of me. The house had settled into that deep silence that only comes in the early hours, when even the world outside seems to pause. And in that silence, memories began to line up differently than they had before. Things I had dismissed. Moments I had explained away. Small details that, at the time, felt harmless. I could see them now with a clarity that made my chest tighten, not with pain, but with recognition. I remembered the first time Daniel had insisted on coming with me to the bank, saying it would be easier if he helped manage things after Robert passed. He had been so gentle about it, so patient, explaining every step as if he were doing me a favor. I had felt grateful, proud even that my son cared enough to step in. I remembered the way Ashley had started asking casual questions during visits. Nothing too direct, just curious enough to seem polite. How much I was spending each month, whether I still had the same accounts, whether I had considered consolidating everything into one place. At the time, it had felt like conversation. Now it sounded like preparation. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting each memory settle into place like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a complete picture. There had been no rush, no urgency, just a steady, careful approach that made everything seem normal until it was not. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone again, scrolling through older messages from Daniel. There it was, buried between casual check-ins and holiday plans. Did you get that transfer set up, Mom? It will just make things easier for both of us. Trust me, I have got you. I let out a slow breath, not surprised, just aware. The words had been there all along. I had just chosen to hear them differently. I stood up and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the faint outline of the street under the early morning sky. Everything looked calm out there. Ordinary. The same houses, the same quiet sidewalks. No one would look at this place and think anything had changed. But inside this house, something had shifted completely. I was not the same woman who had sat at that dinner table just hours ago, waiting for an explanation. I did not need one anymore, because explanations belonged to people who still believed they were owed honesty. And I understood now that honesty had not been part of this for a long time. I turned away from the window and walked back to the desk, this time with purpose. I gathered the documents neatly, aligning the edges, stacking them with care. There was something grounding about the order of it, about putting things exactly where they needed to be. Control did not come from raising your voice or demanding answers. It came from knowing what you had and what you were willing to do with it. I opened another drawer and pulled out a small notebook, one I had not used in years. The pages were still crisp, untouched. I flipped it open and picked up a pen, pausing for just a second before writing the first line. Dates, amounts, names, not emotions, not questions, just facts. One by one, I began to document everything I had seen, everything I had traced back through the account history. Each entry felt like reclaiming something that had been quietly taken from me. Not the money, that was already gone, but the narrative, the truth of what had happened. And as the list grew longer, something else became clear. This was not just about what they had done. It was about what they believed I would not do. They believed I would stay quiet, that I would accept it, maybe even blame myself for not understanding sooner. They believed I would shrink into the role they had already assigned me. I set the pen down and looked at the page, the ink still fresh under the lamplight. A small, deliberate record of a much larger reality. Then I closed the notebook gently and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it beneath my palm. They had taken something from me, yes. But in doing so, they had also revealed something far more valuable. They had shown me exactly who they were. And more importantly, they had reminded me of who I was not. I stood there for a moment longer, the house, still quiet around me, and allowed myself a single, steady breath. No anger. No fear. Just clarity. Because now that I could see the full shape of what had been done, I could finally decide what came next. And this time, the decision would be entirely mine. By the time the sun rose, I had already made my first decision. Not a dramatic one, not something anyone else would notice, but a quiet shift that changed everything. I would not confront them again. Not yet. There was no value in repeating a conversation where the outcome had already been decided before I even spoke. Instead, I would listen. I would watch. And I would let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. That morning, I made my coffee the same way I always did, measuring the grounds carefully, pouring the hot water slowly, as if nothing in my life had been rearranged overnight. The routine mattered. It grounded me. I carried the cup to the window and stood there, looking out at the same street I had seen for decades, but this time I was not thinking about the past. I was thinking about patterns, about timing, about what I had missed before because I had trusted too easily. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His name appeared on my phone screen, and for a brief moment, I simply looked at it, remembering how quickly I used to answer. I let it ring twice before picking up. "Mom," he said, his voice lighter than it had been the night before, almost casual, as if we had only discussed something trivial. "I have been thinking about what you said." I did not remind him that I had said very little. "Have you?" I replied calmly. There was a small pause on the other end, just enough to tell me he was adjusting, recalculating. "I just think we should move forward," he continued. "No need to make this into something bigger than it is." I stepped away from the window and sat down at the table, resting my hand lightly against the surface. "Of course," I said. "There is no reason to make anything bigger." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "Good," he said, relief slipping into his tone before he could hide it. "That is what I was hoping you would say." I could almost picture Ashley nearby, listening, waiting to see how this conversation would unfold. I had seen that dynamic before. Daniel speaking, Ashley observing, both of them aligned in a way that left no room for anyone else. "You should come by this weekend," he added. "We can have dinner again. Keep things normal." Normal. The word lingered in my mind after we ended the call. I set the phone down gently and allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile. Normal was exactly what I intended to give them. That evening, I reviewed my notes again, adding small details I had not written before. The timing of certain transfers. The days Daniel had visited. The moments Ashley had asked seemingly innocent questions. Each piece fit into place more clearly now, not because I was discovering anything new, but because I was finally looking without hesitation. The following day, I made another decision. I drove to the bank. The same building I had walked into countless times without a second thought now felt different, not threatening, but purposeful. I greeted the teller with the same polite nod I had always used, my voice steady as I asked to speak with an advisor. When I sat down in that small office, I did not mention feelings or accusations. I spoke in facts, dates, transactions, authorizations. The advisor listened carefully, his expression neutral but attentive, and when he turned his screen toward me to review the activity, I could see the shift in his posture. Subtle, but there. Recognition. "We can take steps to secure what remains," he said, "and review the authorization history in more detail." I nodded. That would be appropriate. There was no urgency in my tone, no panic, just clarity. Because this was no longer about reacting. It was about positioning. When I left the bank, I did not feel lighter. I felt aligned. Like everything was moving in the direction it needed to move. That weekend, I prepared dinner again. The same table. The same dishes. The same careful arrangement. If someone had walked in without context, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just a mother setting a table for her son. But I knew better. And soon they would too. They arrived exactly on time that weekend, just as I knew they would. Daniel always valued punctuality when it suited him, and Ashley followed his rhythm with quiet precision. I heard the car door close. Then footsteps along the front path, measured and confident. I adjusted the plates one last time before walking to the door, my expression calm, my posture steady. When I opened it, Daniel smiled first, a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Smells good, Mom," he said, stepping inside as if nothing had changed. Ashley followed, her gaze sweeping the room in a quick, subtle scan before settling on me. "Everything looks beautiful," she added, her tone warm, but controlled. I stepped aside to let them in. "Dinner is ready," I said simply.
No tensión. No hesitación.
Just the same words I had used for years. They moved toward the dining room, taking their usual seats without asking, without thinking. Routine has a way of hiding intention when it is repeated often enough. I sat across from them this time, not at the head of the table. A small shift, but a deliberate one. From here, I could see both of them clearly. Every glance, every movement, every moment of unspoken communication between them. We began eating, the clink of silverware filling the space where conversation should have been. Daniel commented on the chicken. Ashley mentioned the seasoning. Simple observations, carefully chosen to maintain the appearance of normalcy. I listened, nodding occasionally, offering just enough response to keep the rhythm intact. But I was not really part of the conversation. I was observing it. So, Daniel said after a few minutes, setting his fork down, I think it is good that we are all on the same page now. I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since they arrived. Which page is that? I asked. He hesitated, just briefly. That we are moving forward, he replied. No hard feelings. No hard feelings. I let the words settle between us, watching the way Ashley's fingers tightened slightly around her glass before relaxing again. Small details. Easy to miss if you were not looking. Of course, I said. Moving forward is important. Daniel nodded, satisfied, and reached for his drink. That was when I placed my fork down, aligning it carefully beside my plate. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the moment. I went to the bank, I said. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. Daniel's hand paused midair for a fraction of a second before continuing. Ashley's gaze flickered, then steadied. Oh, Daniel said, keeping his tone light. For what? I folded my hands in front of me, resting them on the table. To understand the accounts better, I replied. There were a few details I wanted clarified. Silence followed. Not heavy, not uncomfortable on the surface, but different. Measured. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged, but his eyes more focused now. And, he asked. I held his gaze. And I found what I needed. I did not elaborate. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the statement exist, complete on its own. Ashley set her glass down gently. That is good, she said, her tone even. It is always better to have clarity. I nodded once. Yes, I said. Clarity changes everything. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us shifted again, not visibly, but unmistakably. They were listening now, not casually, not confidently, carefully. I picked up my napkin and adjusted it in my lap, the movement slow, deliberate. I also reviewed some documents. I continued, my voice steady. Important ones. Daniel's expression tightened, just enough for me to notice. What kind of documents? He asked. I met his eyes again, holding them a second longer than necessary. The kind that determine what happens next, I said. I could see it then. The first real crack in their certainty. Not fear. Not yet, but awareness. The realization that something had shifted beyond their control. And still, I did not explain further. I returned to my plate, picked up my fork, and continued eating as if nothing significant had been said at all. Because the truth did not need to be forced into the open. It only needed to be placed where it could no longer be ignored. And as the quiet settled over the table once more, I knew they could feel it just as clearly as I could. The difference was they still did not understand what it meant. Not yet. Daniel did not speak immediately after that. He picked up his fork again, but this time he did not eat. He just moved the food around on his plate, as if buying himself time to think. Ashley was quieter than before, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now, fixed on me in a way that suggested she was no longer just observing. She was calculating. I continued my meal at the same steady pace, cutting the chicken into small, even pieces, taking measured bites, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable for them, not for me. You are being vague, Daniel said finally, his voice controlled but firmer than before. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am being precise, I replied. There is a difference. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose in a way I recognized from years ago, when he was frustrated but trying to appear composed. If you have something to say, Mom, just say it, he added. I tilted my head just a fraction, considering him. I already have, I said calmly. You just have not decided how to hear it yet. Ashley shifted in her seat, placing both hands flat on the table now, her fingers lightly touching the surface, as if grounding herself. We're trying to understand what you mean, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I nodded once. Of course you are. I reached for my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down in the exact same spot. Every movement intentional. Every pause deliberate. The bank confirmed the authorization trail. I continued. Every transfer. Every signature. Every access point. Daniel's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Ashley's eyes flickered for just a moment, then steadied again. That does not change anything, Daniel said after a second, his voice lower now. I had access. You agreed to that. I did not argue. I did not interrupt. I simply let him finish. And I used that access, he continued.
For us.
For things that matter. You are not using that money. There it was again. The same justification, now repeated with more confidence, as if saying it enough times might make it true. I folded my hands together on the table, resting them gently in front of me. You are right about one thing, I said. He looked up quickly, a hint of relief crossing his face before he could stop it. I did agree to give you access. I paused, just long enough to let that settle. What I did not agree to, I added, my voice still calm, was to lose control. The room went still. Not silent, because the faint hum of the house was always there, but still, in a way that made every word feel heavier. Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the change. The confidence was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Uncertainty. You are making this sound worse than it is, he said, though the conviction in his voice had softened. I shook my head slightly.
No, irraplia.
I am making it clear. Ashley leaned forward just a fraction, her voice softer now. Margaret, we have always wanted what is best for you, she said. I met her eyes, holding them steady. That is an interesting statement, I said, because what is best for me has never required me to be uninformed. She did not respond immediately. For the first time since they arrived, she looked away first. Daniel let out a breath and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times when he felt cornered, though he would never call it that. So what now? He asked. The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but heavier underneath. I sat back in my chair, letting the wood support me as I considered him for a moment. Now, I said slowly, we continue dinner. He blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. That is it, he asked. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod.
For now, I said.
And then I picked up my fork again and resumed eating, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Because, in a way, it had. Not the full story, not the final outcome, but the part where they realized something had shifted beyond their understanding. And as I sat there, calm and steady, I could feel it settling in around them. Not panic, not fear, just the beginning of awareness. The kind that grows slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would not be the ones deciding what came next. The rest of the dinner passed without anything that could be called an argument, but nothing about it was normal. Every word was measured, every movement observed, and every silence carried more meaning than anything spoken out loud. Daniel tried once or twice to bring the conversation back to safer ground, mentioning work, a new project, something about a colleague moving out of state, but the words fell flat between us. Ashley followed his lead, adding small comments, asking polite questions, but her attention never fully left me. She was watching for something, waiting for a reaction that never came. When the plates were empty, I stood and gathered them without asking for help, just as I always had. Daniel remained seated for a moment before standing, as if unsure whether to follow me or stay where he was.
He chose to follow.
Let me help, he said, reaching for a plate. I handed it to him, without hesitation. Of course, I replied. We worked side by side in the kitchen, the familiarity of the task almost convincing if you did not know better. The sound of running water filled the space as I washed and he dried, just like his father used to do. For a brief second, The rhythm of it pulled at something old, something I had not fully let go of. But I did not allow it to settle. I focused on the present, on the quiet difference in how he stood, how he avoided looking at me directly, how he seemed to be waiting for something I had not given him. "You do not have to do all of this alone," he said after a while, his voice softer now. "We are still your family." I rinsed a plate and set it aside before answering. "Yes," I said. "You are." I did not add anything else. The simplicity of the statement seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. When we finished, I dried my hands carefully and turned back toward the dining room. Ashley was already standing near the table, her coat draped over her arm, her posture composed but alert. "Thank you for dinner," she said, offering a small smile. "It was lovely." I nodded. "You are welcome." Daniel picked up his keys from the counter, glancing between us as if trying to read something that was no longer visible.
"We should head out," he said.
"Early morning tomorrow." I walked them to the door, the same way I always had, the same quiet routine repeated once more. When I opened it, the cool evening air slipped inside, carrying with it a sense of finality that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge. "Drive safely," I said. Daniel hesitated for just a second, then stepped forward and gave me a brief, careful hug. It was lighter than it used to be, more controlled, as if even that gesture had been adjusted. "We will talk soon," he said. I met his eyes, holding them steady. "Yes," I replied. "We will." Ashley offered a quick embrace as well, her movements precise, her smile unchanged. Then they were gone, their footsteps fading down the path, the car door closing, the engine starting. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching the taillights disappear into the distance, then closed the door quietly behind me. The house returned to its silence, but it was no longer hollow. It was settled, grounded. I walked back to the dining room, taking in the clean table, the empty chairs, the absence of tension that had filled the space just minutes before. Then I turned toward the hallway and made my way to the desk. The notebook was still there, exactly where I had left it. I opened it and added a few more lines. Observations from the evening. Reactions. Pauses. The way Daniel's voice shifted when I mentioned the bank. The way Ashley's eyes moved when I spoke about documents. Small details, but important ones. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Then I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. I did not call immediately. I simply looked at it, considering the next step not as a reaction, but as a continuation of something already in motion. After a moment, I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the ring. When the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I spoke clearly. "This is Margaret Collins," I said. "I would like to schedule an appointment to review my estate documents." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded, asking for details, offering times. I listened, selected a date, confirmed it without hesitation. When the call ended, I set the phone down gently and rested my hand on the desk. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not waiting, just ready. Because whatever came next was no longer something I had to brace for. It was something I had already begun. The appointment was set for Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock and I arrived 15 minutes early, just as I always had for anything that mattered. The law office sat on the corner of a quiet street, the kind of place that did not draw attention to itself, but carried a certain weight once you stepped inside. I had been there once before, years ago, when Robert and I first put our plans in writing. Back then, it had felt like preparation for a distant future. Now it felt like something else entirely. I sat in the waiting area, my hands resting calmly in my lap, observing the small details around me. The muted colors, the framed certificates on the wall, the low hum of a printer somewhere behind a closed door. Nothing about the space had changed, and yet I had. When my name was called, I stood and followed the assistant down the hallway, my steps steady, my thoughts clear. The attorney greeted me with a polite smile, gesturing for me to sit. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "it has been a while." I nodded. "It has," I replied. "But I believe it is time to revisit a few things." He listened without interruption as I explained what needed to be reviewed. I did not speak in emotion. I did not assign blame. I simply laid out the facts, the structure, the adjustments I intended to make. Accounts, access, beneficiaries, control. Each word precise, each decision deliberate. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, considering the information with a measured expression. We can certainly make those changes, he said. Are you sure you would like to proceed this way? I met his gaze, without hesitation. Yes, I said. I am. There was no doubt in my voice, no uncertainty left to negotiate. Because this was no longer about preserving what had been. It was about defining what would remain. The paperwork took time, but I did not rush it. I read each line carefully, understanding not just the words, but the weight behind them. When I signed my name, it felt different than it had years ago. Back then, it had been about protection. Now, it was about clarity. When I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, cleaner somehow, as if something had shifted into place. I drove home without turning on the radio, allowing the quiet to settle around me. There was nothing left to question, only steps to follow through. That afternoon, I made a few additional calls. The bank, a different advisor, a confirmation of changes already in motion. Each conversation brief, professional, and to the point. By the time the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the living room floor, everything that needed to be secured had been addressed. Not undone, but contained. And that was enough. That evening, I sat at the dining table again, not out of habit this time, but by choice. The same chair, the same view, but the room felt entirely different. Lighter, not because anything had been restored, but because nothing was uncertain anymore. I reached for the notebook and opened it, adding a final entry beneath the others. Date. Time. Completed. I closed it gently and set it aside, my hand resting on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. Then I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself a single, quiet breath. Not relief, not satisfaction, just completion. The phone rang shortly after. Daniel's name appeared on the screen again, and this time I answered without hesitation. Mom, he said, his voice carrying a different tone now, less certain, more probing. I was thinking maybe we should talk again. About everything. I listened for a moment before responding. We already have, I said calmly. There was a pause, longer than before. That is not what I meant, he replied. I looked around the room, taking in the space that had once felt so familiar, now fully my own again in a way I had not realized I had lost. I know, I said, but it is enough. Silence followed, heavier this time, filled with something he could not quite define. So what happens now? He asked. I let the question sit between us, not because I did not have an answer, but because I understood that he was not asking for information. He was asking for control. And that was no longer something I was willing to give. Now, I said finally, my voice steady, things continue exactly as they are. And before he could respond, I ended the call, placing the phone gently on the table. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer waiting for anything, because what needed to be done had already been done, and whatever came next would not be decided by them. 3 days passed before I saw them again, and this time they did not wait for an invitation. I heard the knock just after noon, firm but not forceful, the kind of knock that assumes the door will be opened. I was in the living room, folding a blanket, when it came, and I took my time setting it neatly over the arm of the chair before walking to the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there with Ashley beside him, both of them dressed more carefully than usual, as if they had prepared for something important. His expression was not the same as before. The certainty was gone. In its place was something tighter, more controlled. We need to talk, he said. I stepped aside without a word, allowing them in. The house felt different with them inside now. Not tense, not heavy, just observed. They moved into the dining room automatically, taking the same seats they always had, but this time there was no food on the table, no distractions, no routine to hide behind. I remained standing for a moment before sitting down across from them, my hands resting calmly in front of me. I went to the bank, Daniel said, getting straight to the point. They told me the accounts have been restricted. I nodded once. Yes, I said. He leaned forward slightly, his voice sharpening. You did that without telling me. I met his gaze steadily. It was not something that required your approval. Ashley shifted beside him, her posture more rigid now, her eyes searching my face for something she could use. We were managing things together, she said. You agreed to that. I did not look at her immediately. When I did, my expression did not change. I agreed to transparency, I replied. Not to absence. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair again, but this time the gesture carried more weight. This is not fair, he said. You are making it seem like we did something wrong. I let the silence sit for a moment before answering. You are the one deciding how it seems, I said. I am only addressing what is. He stared at me, frustration building beneath the surface. That money was part of our future, he said. We had plans. I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. Yes, I said. You did. The distinction was subtle, but it landed. Exactly where it needed to. Ashley leaned forward now, her voice quieter, more controlled. Margaret, this is not how families handle things, she said. I folded my hands together, resting them lightly on the table.
No, irrablia.
It is not. For a moment, no one spoke. The room held the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. Then Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between us.
We spoke to someone, he said.
We want to fix this. I looked at the folder, but did not reach for it. Fix what? I asked. He hesitated just for a second. The misunderstanding, he said. I allowed a small pause before responding. There is no misunderstanding, I said calmly. There is only clarity. I finally reached forward, not to open the folder, but to slide it gently back toward him. You should keep that, I added. Ashley's composure faltered for the first time, her fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table. So that is it, she asked. You are just going to cut us out? I met her eyes, steady and unyielding. I am not cutting anyone out, I said. I am simply deciding what remains within my control. Daniel sat back slowly, the realization settling in more fully now. Not all at once, but enough. You cannot do this, he said, though his voice had lost its certainty. I did not raise mine. I already have, I replied. The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. They were final in a way that did not require emphasis. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just complete. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Then he stood, Ashley following a second later. Neither of them spoke as they moved toward the door.
I did not walk them out this time.
I remained seated, listening to the sound of their footsteps fade, the door opening, then closing. When the house returned to silence, I allowed myself one final glance around the room. Everything was exactly where it should be. Nothing missing. Nothing uncertain. And as I sat there, alone but no longer diminished, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had not lost anything that was truly mine. I had only let go of what never should have been taken in the first place.